Good evening, everyone. I'm Sohail Hashmi, Chair of the International Relations Department here at Mount Holyoke, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our campus, students and outsiders alike. Welcome to all of you. The IR department is proud to co-sponsor with Critical Connections this important discussion. There's never a dull moment when you're a student of Middle East politics. However, this particular moment is extraordinarily intense. When Mahlaka contacted me in early September to plan this event, we expected the focus would be on the escalating tensions in the Persian Gulf and the possibility of military action by the United States against Iran. We also expected the conflict in Yemen to be part of the discussion, as Saudi Arabia and its regional partners, with American backing, waged a war against Iran and its allies in that devastated country. Well, those topics are still very much on the agenda for tonight. Indeed, a number of subsequent events, including the attack on the Saudi oil facility and the response by the Saudis to it, have made them even more urgent. But since that initial conversation in September, many other urgent concerns have crowded onto our agenda. Donald Trump abruptly canceled peace talks with the Taliban, apparently after first inviting them to a meeting at Camp David. Israel went through yet another indecisive election. Violent protests rocked Baghdad. And just 2 days ago, Turkey launched military action against Kurds in northern Syria. All of these events have unfolded as questions about how American foreign policy is being made assume critical importance against the backdrop of the impeachment inquiry. So in short, we have an impossibly packed agenda to cover in the next 2 hours. But fortunately, we have two leading experts who will make the impossible possible. Right, gentlemen?
Lower expectations.
So now it's my pleasure to introduce Matthias Ambani, who will introduce our guests.
Great, thank you so much, Sohail, and thank you so much to the Department of International Relations here at Mount Holyoke for co-sponsoring this event with us. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matthias Ambani. I am the Director of Critical Connections, an organization here in the Valley that puts together events on issues related to American Muslims and other targeted communities. So our event today, as Sohail mentioned, comes at a time of great flux in the Middle East. We've already talked about rising tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, especially after the oil facilities were attacked on September 15th. We thought that the 8-year war in Syria was beginning to draw down somewhat, but again, it's descending into violence and conflict, especially in the northeastern region. And of course, the war continues in Yemen, and as Sohail mentioned, Iraq is being racked by protests and demonstrations, etc. To sort of understand what the US involvement in the region is going to be, and to sort of understand the radical shifts that have taken place in US foreign policy under the Trump administration, and to give us a sense of the great and unmatched wisdom of the Trump administration in the region. We are joined today by two brilliant analysts, Dr. Stephen Walt and Dr. Trita Parsi, and we are very fortunate to have them here. I'm just going to briefly introduce them, and then what we're going to do is have a series of questions that Sohail and I will pose to them, and after that we will open it up to a Q&A, and hopefully we'll have an interactive and lively discussion. So with that, again, thank you both so much for being here. I'll start with Dr. Walt, who is the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. He has been a resident associate of the Carnegie Endowment for Peace and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution. He presently serves on the editorial boards of Foreign Policy, Security Studies, International Relations, and Journal of Cold War Studies, and he also serves as co-editor of the Cornell Studies in Security Affairs, published by Cornell University Press. Additionally, he was elected as a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in May 2005. Professor Walt is the author of The Origins of Alliances, which received the 1988 Edgar Furness National Security Book Award. He is also the author of Revolution and War, Taming American Power, The Global Response to US Primacy, and with co-author J.J. Mearsheimer, the Israel Lobby. And then to my immediate left is Dr. Trita Parsi, who is the 2010 recipient of the 200,000, and I never know how to pronounce this word.
I didn't know either until I won it. Gromeyer.
Gromeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He is an award-winning author with a focus on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. His first book, Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the U.S., won the Gromeyer Award and Council of Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Award in 2008. His second book, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, was selected as the best book on the Middle East in 2012 by Foreign Affairs. His latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, reveals the behind-the-scenes story to the historic nuclear deal with Iran. Dr. Parsi is the president of the largest Iranian-American grassroots organization in the U.S., the National Iranian-American Council, and has taught at Johns Hopkins University and George Washington. He currently teaches at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. However, he is most well known for his appearance on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and also the Colbert Report, so you should definitely check those videos out. He's quite hilarious. So I think with that, we can begin. Please join me in welcoming both our speakers today. So I think I'm going to ask the first question and make it quite broad before we get into specific questions, specific countries in the Middle East. Let's start with, does the Trump administration have a Middle East policy? If so, what are its main points? And whoever wants to go first.
I'll take a swing at that one. So I'd say I'm going to be a little bit provocative in my answer. First point I would make, which is obvious to everybody, is that Donald Trump really doesn't care at all about anybody in the Middle East. Right? He has no personal ties, affection, regard for any of the countries. I think he really doesn't care. That may not be confined just to the Middle East. To the extent that the Trump administration has a Middle East policy, though, I would argue that it's actually not as different from what American policy has been in the past. It is not, in fact, a radical change. It's not a 180-degree reversal of what American policy has been. And let me unpack that just a little bit. We still have the same set of allies we've always had in the Middle East. Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan. We still have the same enemies in the Middle East that we've had in recent years, most notably Iran, but also the Assad regime in Syria. What Trump has done is simply double down on all of those existing relationships, which were existing relations, in the case of our allies, of unconditional American support. Basically, whatever Egypt wants to do, it's okay with us. Whatever Israel wants to do, okay by us. Whatever the Saudis want to do, okay by us. That's basically what all American administrations have been doing in recent decades. And Trump is sort of just doing more of that, and more obviously. So, for example, many people were shocked when he said he was actually going to follow up and move the American embassy to Jerusalem, something that all of his predecessors had promised to do while running for president and then had found reasons, good reasons, not to do. Of course, people said, well, this will end the peace process if he does that, to which the only answer was, what peace process? Right? So one could argue that all the Trump administration has been doing, say with respect to Israel-Palestine, is removing the hypocrisy, where we would pretend to try to mediate a peace process, but actually not do very much about it. Now, the one big change he made was, of course, he tore up the nuclear deal with Iran and began the so-called maximum pressure policy. I'll just say that this was an issue that Washington, D.C. was deeply divided on. The Iran issue was one of those places where there wasn't a consensus, and the Obama administration had to work very, very hard to get that deal through. They would never have gotten it through the Senate, of course, which is why it was an executive agreement, and all Trump did was side with the other side in that particular debate, and in imposing maximum pressure on Iran, he's basically reverted to the policy of the Bush administration, which was to try and squeeze Iran for as long as possible until they give us everything we want. It didn't work for Bush. It's not working for Trump as well. Similarly, he's backed the Saudis in their war in Yemen. Guess who else backed the Saudis in their war in Yemen? Barack Obama. I don't think he did it with the same enthusiasm. I don't know what Barack Obama would have done as president had he been president when Jamal Khashoggi was murdered. But the point is that Trump's policy towards Saudi Arabia is not a radical shift in what American policy has been. Neither is his policy towards Israel, the Palestinians, Egypt, or Iran. It's not a radical change. So in that sense, no, I don't think he has his own unique foreign policy. He's got just a more extreme version of what American policy in the Middle East has been for a long time, which, as you all know, has been working really, really well. I'll stop there.
How would you like to respond to what Dr. Pol said, and do you also have?
Steve could not be more wrong. Everything. Just kidding. No, I find myself in violent agreement with what he's saying here. I would add a couple of things. I think actually in some ways it is good that the current president is removing some of the facade of consistency and that really never has been there. He has taken our past foreign policy, turned it into a caricature of itself, enabling us to actually see the flaws that always have been there. I find it very amusing. Amusing may be the wrong word. I'm grateful that they're speaking out now, but the very same Obama officials that are now very critical of the Yemen war were the same ones that helped approve it. Now, I have an understanding as to why they did so. It was a calculation they made because they were in the midst of the Iran nuclear negotiations, and if they had not gone along, they feared that Saudi Arabia would have become even more problematic in seeking to undermine the nuclear deal. And in policy making, you oftentimes have to choose between bad options. But it's important to keep in mind that this actually was approved during the Obama era. I would actually go as far as to say that the real contradiction is not what Trump is doing on Iran, for instance. The contradiction or the exception was what Obama did in the last 3 or so years. That was the real remarkable shift, a remarkable shift that we should have sustained. But we went back to what essentially has been normal for the last 40 years with what Trump did and ripping it up and going back to maximum pressure. The difference being is that he's not in the habit of turning his policies or his decisions or wrapping them into really nice rhetoric that makes it appear as if we're doing this for some greater good. When it comes to why didn't he impose more sanctions earlier as he had promised, he said, well, the oil market wouldn't take it. If he's asking them, why are you friends with the Saudis? Will they buy our weapons? This is all true, but no previous president would have been truthful to us if that question was asked. And Trump in some ways is, and I think it's helping reveal some of the real problematic contradictions that exist in this. But when it comes to the question of what is the policy, I think part of what has been a cornerstone, some of these building blocks of this hypocrisy, is that Trump has simultaneously allowed his administration to pursue 3 to 5 different policies towards the Middle East at the same time. He's on Twitter now complaining and saying, we were never in Syria to help the Kurds, we were there just to get rid of ISIS, so our mission is finished, we should leave. I personally happen to believe that that is the case. We should be leaving. Those 2,000 troops are there in search of a mission. They're not with a mission. But it was also his national security advisor that less than a year ago, John Bolton, who changed the mission and said our new mission in Syria is that we're going to stay there until we have rolled back Iranian influence. Well, that's a generational project right there. That's been going on in Iraq since 2003, and we've gotten absolutely nowhere. That was Trump's national security advisor, and Trump allowed that to happen. Jim Jeffries had been going around the country and doing all kinds of different things, none of which I think Trump would approve if he cared to look into what his policy was. But it's been going on. And now we're in a situation in which I think there's a tremendous amount of correct criticism of what the Trump administration is doing, because some of the folks that have decided to rely on the Trump administration have not relied on a false hope. They relied on the policies that Bolton or Jim Jeffries or someone else was pursuing, assuming that the US government essentially was a unitary actor in at least some sense of that word. And under Trump, that is certainly not the case.
Well, Dr. Parsi has already begun to delve into the first, detailed question that we wanted to pose. So let me ask Professor Walt if he wants to address what is happening now in the Syrian case.
I think this is a classic case, and you've seen it in other parts of the Trump administration's foreign policy, where the president has, a decent instinct, an impulse that's not wrong, right, and then manages to pursue it in the worst possible way, so that you actually end up, with a worse situation. So the idea that the United States should not have troops in northern Syria forever is a good impulse. The idea that they shouldn't be there if there isn't a clear mission for them, that's the right impulse. But then to simply announce it, that you're going to redeploy and order them redeployed, and by the way, give a green light for a Turkish invasion, was exactly the wrong way to do it. Not only does it make our decision-making look chaotic, impulsive, unreliable, incompetent, and you never want to look incompetent in the conduct of foreign policy, but he's managed to squander whatever influence we might have had there, any capacity to try and shape ultimately a diplomatic outcome without, in fact, removing American troops. There are no fewer American troops here today, there today than there were before. They've just moved to a different part of Syria, right, where they don't have actually, in some respects, even less to do. Right, so it's not that he actually brought any troops home or ended American involvement there. What he did was simply squander whatever influence we might have had over the outcome. And he did it for nothing. He didn't get a concession from Erdogan for giving them permission. He didn't get a concession from the Assad regime for redeploying them. He didn't gain any influence with any of the other actors. He simply gave it away because he had this impulse that it was time for the American mission there to change. And again, I think it's true to put very nicely, what it just reveals all along is that this is an administration that has never been able to develop a coherent strategy for doing anything. If by a strategy you mean a sort of careful plan of how step one will lead to step two, which will lead to step three, which will lead us to the outcome that we actually want. And I think this is a perfect illustration of, again, the right impulse pursued in exactly the wrong way.
But the right impulse, yes.
Could I add a couple of things on Syria? I think Syria is a telling example of how American foreign policy has gotten so militarized over the course of the last 25 years. And we see an indication of that in the extent to which we're constantly talking about troops here, troops there. We have more than 850 bases around the world. But another, perhaps even more dangerous indication of it is in the manner in which we don't see other things. When Trump first said that he's going to leave Syria, that was December of last year, if I'm not mistaken. You had several commentators and anchors on TV that essentially had temper tantrums on TV and were absolutely incensed that this was happening. The same people, incidentally, had the week before complained about our never-ending wars, and now we're upset that we were actually ending one, or at least that he said that he was going to end some. You had senior people, including Mattis, resign over that decision. Now here's the interesting thing. We're talking about 2,000 troops. Hardly any leverage for the United States whatsoever. Does not make a difference in any significant way, one way or another. The real retreat of American influence, the real thing that actually did have an impact, was a decision that Trump made in the very early months of his presidency, when he decided that the United States should no longer partake in the Geneva process, the negotiations for the future of Syria, trying to find some sort of a political solution, which is inevitable. These wars always have to end with some sort of a political process. That Geneva process then turned into what is today called the Astana process. It is led by Iran, Turkey, and Russia. They're the ones who are calling the shots. They're the ones who are shaping the outcome of that war, shaping the outcome of the political settlement. The United States just left. No one threw a temper tantrum on TV. No one resigned, and I would suspect that most people in this room did not even know that this happened. That's where real retreat and withdrawal and all of these words that are being used as if it's extremely shameful, that's when it really happened. But because it did not include any troops, it goes under our radar because our mindset has become such that we only view our own power, our own influence, our own engagement with the world through the prism of, are we bombing them? Do we have troops there? Do we have a base there? If we don't, nothing is really happening. This is the most, in my view, the most important fundamental shift that needs to take place in order for the United States to get its foreign policy right. And it won't happen just because one or two presidents nudge it in this or that direction. It's really a mentality shift that needs to change, in which the only metric of our engagement is whether we are engaged militarily.
I have to add one other point that Judy just reminded me of in what he said. The great argument you always hear whenever there's a suggestion that the United States should reduce its military footprint somewhere is that this will have a horrible effect on American credibility. That if we leave Syria, if we leave Afghanistan, if we leave fill in the blank, our other partners won't trust us anymore. They won't rely upon it. They won't believe in us. No one will ever cooperate with us again. And what you need to understand about this is, first of all, the United States has abandoned allies in the past, right, and didn't have trouble finding new ones when it needed them. And that what gives a commitment credibility is not what you're doing somewhere else. It's whether others recognize that you have a genuine interest in that commitment. Right? Nobody doubts the American commitment to defend Massachusetts or defend California, right? Because that's part of our country. It's obviously a vital interest.
It's an administration.
Nobody doubted, in a serious way, the American commitment to contain the Soviet Union and defend our European allies during World War II, because it was obvious that that was a vital interest. Where credibility becomes a problem is when you've made a commitment that others recognize isn't that important to you, right? And what we have, of course, around the world now is all sorts of commitments and military presences in places that really aren't that vital to the United States. And that's why people get nervous. Well, if we pulled out of this one, my God, people in other places that are not vital interests might absolutely question whether or not we are committed to them, because there are good reasons to question whether we're committed, because in fact there isn't a vital American interest there. That doesn't mean the United States has no interest anywhere, shouldn't be committed in a variety of places, and shouldn't be in fact militarily strong. But this whole credibility argument is because people understand that we are in fact overcommitted, and the only way to try and sustain all of those is to fool everybody into believing you'll honor every one of them, and therefore you can never remove or end any of them. The forever wars have to continue. Which is not
to just really drive the point home. It's not
we'll get to another
the
question.
withdrawal, of the troops or breaking a promise to the Kurds in this specific case that causes loss of credibility. It's the fact that we made promises that everyone knew, including us, that we were not going to be able to keep. The fact that we constantly do that is the reason why we're losing credibility. The Iranians in the region are playing a much savvier game, partly because this is their Massachusetts. They're going to always be there. So they can't afford to pursue a policy in which they can commit so many errors. Their margin of error is much, much smaller. So they're very adamant about making sure that they live up to their commitments, and they give far fewer commitments than we do, because they know that that's how you lose it. We are so generous with commitments that we're, really undermining ourselves. And the fact that Steve had to explain what the real meaning of credibility is an indication of how bad the situation is. But we have to remind ourselves of what it actually means to have credibility.
So I'm sure we'll have lots of follow-up questions to what was just discussed about Syria, but sort of speaking about Iran and it not making as many commitments. So moving on to that, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, there was hope that President Rouhani and President Trump would be able to meet because of France's mediation efforts. That didn't actually happen, but both countries sort of left that possibility open to return to negotiations. And I'm wondering what you think is the possibility of that, given the internal political dynamics in both Iran and the US.
Thank you. Give me some time for this question. I want to unpack a couple of things here. Last year in May, Trump walks out of the nuclear deal. He had already walked out of the Paris Agreement and a bunch of other things. And he reimposes the sanctions. Some of those sanctions did not need to be reimposed because most companies had already left Iran, recognizing that at some point Trump was likely to remove the US from the deal, which essentially means that the US is in violation of a UN Security Council resolution. At first, for the first year actually, the Iranian strategy was to just stay in the deal, take the high road, and continue to live up to all of its commitments, hoping that the Europeans and the Russians and others would be able to provide Iran at least with a portion of the economic benefits that they were promised. And for about a year, it actually worked out quite okay. They were not happy with the situation, but they were still selling roughly 1 million barrels of oil a day, and they could continue that way, and the best bet for their end was to just wait for Trump to be unelected. Then this May, Trump does something else. He removes 8 sanctions waivers for other countries so they could buy that 1 million barrels of oil from Iran, and essentially moves to push out all of Iran's oil from the oil market. This then became a crisis on the Iranian side, because if they can't sell their oil at all, then clearly that's going to create massive problems. And then we saw for the first time that they started to do 2 things in parallel. One is actually a legal and orderly process. Within the nuclear deal, there are ways for them to say that if the others are not living up to the deal, they can scale back their commitments to the deal as well. And they were doing so in such a way saying that in 60 days they're going to scale back this, after that, another 60 days they're going to scale back this. But everything that they're scaling back can be reversed within 24 hours, and they can quickly be back in compliance. And they've said, if the US and everyone else goes back into compliance, they'll go back into compliance as well. But that was like the good cop strategy. The bad cop strategy is one in which they have a degree of deniable plausibility because no clear evidence has been presented publicly that they were behind it. But I think it is quite reasonable to think that they're definitely the main suspect. We saw some attacks on ships in the Persian Gulf. We saw an American drone that was shot down. The Iranians said that it was inside of Iranian territory, airspace. We had a very quick, brief moment of a potential war. I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail. And then we saw the attacks on the Saudi oil fields, which again, the US government has come out and said the Iranians were behind it. Very, very likely in my view. No evidence has been presented, and there's a big distinction as to whether the Iranians were providing material to the Houthis and then the Houthis did the attack from Yemeni territory. Then that would be an act of war, act of continuous warfare within a context of an existing war. If the attack actually originated from Iranian territory, then that's actually the Iranians directly getting involved in a war. And it would be an act of war. If evidence exists, the US and Saudi Arabia should take that to the UN Security Council, ask for a Chapter 7 resolution. The Russians may or may not veto it, but there's a legal path for the US to handle that. Now, if we depart from the assumption that the Iranians were behind it, so why were they doing this? Well, for about a year, in which they were continuing to comply with the deal, the entire cost and pain of Trump's maximum pressure was borne by the Iranians. No one else suffered from this policy. They suffered tremendously. Their economy has taken a massive, massive hit. And their hope that they would be taking the high roads and other countries would come to their aid led to absolutely nothing, and then Trump further escalated. So now they're doing their counter-escalation. And part of that is to make sure that the pain is spread around. Because if others are feeling the pain of this policy, perhaps they will have more incentives to do something to prevent this policy from continuing, because it's starting to get dangerous for everyone. Particularly if you see the flow of oil in the Persian Gulf, it's being hampered, and obviously that's going to have a negative impact on everyone else. But this goes now to the issue of credibility. Part of the reason why the Iranians, I think, have achieved some of their objectives with this policy, because prior to them doing this, Macron was not doing this shuttle diplomacy and trying to get a deal. Once they started doing so, suddenly the Europeans and others got serious about finding a solution to this issue. Part of it is the credibility. Most countries, if an American drone goes into your territory and you see it on the radar, most countries would switch the channel. They would turn on Netflix and pretend as if nothing happened. The Iranians shut it down and surprised almost everyone, including the US. Then they sent a message to the US saying that if the US responds against an Iranian target, because they insisted that this was in Iranian airspace, the Iranians would retaliate disproportionately, which means it would be an all-out war. Now, the official story is that Trump said that once he figured out that 150 people would get killed, he felt like that's not fair because they shot a flying robot. I don't want to do that. I think there's an element of truth in that. I think the real truth is that he asked, okay, we do this, we kill 150 Iranians, what happens then? And the general said, well, then the Iranians will hit us here, 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 and here. And then we have to hit them here, 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 and here. And then he realized, okay, this is going to be an all-out war. And for many different reasons, partly his own instinct, partly knowing that many of the people that voted for him did so because they felt that, because he presented himself as an anti-war candidate, talking about ending the forever wars, talking about bringing the troops home, thinking that Hillary was too hawkish. And he knows very well that that constituency is still there, and they would not easily forgive him if he started another war, particularly one that will be much, much more difficult than Iraq or any of those other wars. And partly because he recognized that this would have a devastating effect on the global economy, which would then push the US into a recession. And if there's anything that in his mind at least is going his way when it comes to re-election 2020, it's the state of the economy. And he would lose that last card that he has working for him. And as a result, he actually did something that I have to say, I don't think a lot of other presidents would do, which is that if an order had been given and the attack was essentially 10 minutes away from happening, reversing that actually takes some guts. Now, we would not be in this position in the first place had it not been for him creating this disastrous situation. But he walked that back. And then since then, it's frankly been almost a bit embarrassing to see how desperate he is to get the Iranians to talk to him. What happened at the UN was that Macron was trying to get a meeting going. Rouhani was saying no, and I'll explain in a second why the Iranians are so hesitant about talking to Trump. But during the last night or the 2 nights before Rouhani left, Macron rented a suite on the same floor that Rouhani was in at the hotel. And the French went in there and they set up a safe connection, a secure connection. And the idea was that, okay, there won't be a meeting, but Macron will set up a phone call between Trump and Rouhani. And was under the impression that the Iranians had agreed, because the Iranians had in principle said yes to the package, but there was a question about sequencing that is crucial that they had rejected. Trump was on the phone waiting. Macron is happy about it. He goes, waits. Rouhani's not coming. Well, it turned out Rouhani went to bed. And Macron actually had to go and knock on his door at the hotel suite. He said, what's going on? And Rouhani said, no, not going to do the phone call. Now, I'm a strong believer in diplomacy, and I still believe that perhaps the Iranians should, but the reason why they didn't is this. They saw what happened in the North Korean case. Trump loves photo ops. And once he gets his photo op, he's kind of happy and satisfied. And then he doesn't do much movement beyond that. And the Iranians, for them, having a photo op with Trump is not a plus in any way, shape, or form. it's a hugely politically costly thing. So if Rouhani was going to do some sort of a photo op with Trump, even a phone call, he needed to make sure that that would be the end of the process, meaning an agreement had been found, and then they seal it through a photo op or a phone call. He could not go back to Tehran having given Trump a photo op and then coming back completely empty-handed with the sanctions and that pressure continuing. So the issue of the sequencing was that the Iranians wanted to have guarantees that Trump would reissue those waivers, allow the Iranians to sell their oil. And incidentally, just as a parenthesis, when we are imposing sanctions on other countries and punishing them for buying Iranian oil or trading with Iran, we are not only violating a UN Security Council resolution, we are punishing countries for abiding by a UN Security Council resolution. I don't think that ever has happened in the US's history, in which we're punishing countries for actually abiding by a UN Security Council resolution. So they needed the thing to come first, and then they would give a photo op. Trump would not give that. It's not entirely clear why. In my view, because it's very easy for him to offer it, promise it, and he could still reverse it afterwards. But I think from his perspective, he wants to give the impression that the Iranians are coming on their knees begging for mercy. And I think the impression that most people have of what is happening right now is quite the opposite. Their economy is absolutely devastated by these sanctions, but they're not caving on this issue because it's worse for them to cave than to continue to suffer. And that's because we structured the situation in a horribly unintelligent way. We gave them absolutely no reason to come and compromise because we had lost credibility. And this happened already under Obama. Even when the deal was working, the sanctions relief was not working. So the Iranians hardly got what they were promised even under Obama, not by design, but because of a very simple fact. The United States is extremely amazing at imposing sanctions. We have almost zero experience when it comes to lifting sanctions. We almost never lift sanctions. And here we had a massive amount of sanctions that was supposed to be lifted, and we didn't know really how to do it. It really did not end up working.
That was a brilliant and very comprehensive explanation, which I learned a bunch from. But I'm going to add 3 little footnotes to it. First of all, I think actually Trump has a lot of latitude if he wished. Right? You sometimes hear that he's hemmed in by other commitments, he's tied up in terms of domestic politics. He's said so many nasty things about Iran, how could he go the other way? I'd say a couple of things. First of all, we've never had a president who's better at reversing course and pretending he said the exact opposite, right? So that wouldn't bother him. My sense of the Republican Party is they would follow him off a cliff. So it's not like the Republicans, and Lindsey Graham at the end of the day would go along with that. Israel and Saudi Arabia, some other countries in the region would be upset if he did this, but where are they going to go? They have no other options as well. So he could do this if he wanted to. If he wanted to reverse American policy, he could. And as Trita explained, we basically had declared war on Iran. Not by firing missiles at them, but by trying to crater their economy. We were going to try to bring the regime down or get it to capitulate by putting, as they say, maximum pressure on it. And as Trita explained, the Iranians basically called our bluff. They said, we're not going to cave in. And why can they? If they cave into us once when we do this, why can't we just repeat this exercise every time we want? Why you don't want to give in to a blackmailer. Right? Because once you've done it once, they can keep blackmailing you. So they weren't going to give in. And they have now reminded us that they have options. They can make us pay a price. They can make it painful for our allies. So they are not going to give in. And of course, Trump has exposed the weakness of the American position. And the bigger problem, and you, I think, alluded to this, I just want to unpack it slightly, is there is a fundamental problem of trust here. Right? Given that we walked away from the nuclear deal, and given Trump's own track record of reversing course, if you were an Iranian, would you believe any promise Donald Trump made to you? Right? So the Iranians have to see something tangible up front. You would never take an American assurance at this point. If they get something tangible up front, then yes, I think they'd be willing to reopen ties and maybe even talk about other issues that divide us as well. But they're certainly not going to do this on the basis of a photo op or on the basis of a vague American promise. In a sense, they want to see sanctions relief and they want to see the money coming in, the oil purchases happening, and then yes, a phone call would be fine, maybe even more. That's, I think, important to understand as background for all of us.
But so what is Trump's sort of end game with these negotiations? Are they trying to sort of revamp the JCPOA, or are they trying to come up with a new set of negotiations altogether?
If you can figure that out, you're smarter than I am. I've been trying to figure out what the American objective is. Are they trying to get a better nuclear deal, which would be a nice thing to have? You may not be able to get it, because remember, any deal has to give something to both parties. You never enter diplomacy and get everything you want, right? The JCPOA was not everything the United States might have wanted. It was a very good deal from our perspective, but it didn't give us absolutely everything we had wanted. It had to give Iran some things that it wanted, or there would have been no deal. So you might try to get a better deal. You might view the end game as trying to collapse the clerical regime in Iran. That might be our objective. You might try to get Iran to stop doing the various regional activities that we don't seem to like very much. The problem is I can't figure out what the Trump administration's agenda is, because they appear to have pursued all of those things at one time or another. And occasionally with the president saying what he really wants to do is open things up with Iran and help the place develop too. So you can figure it out, you're smarter.
So what do the Europeans want though? Because the Europeans are mediating towards something. So what is that something?
Europeans just want to live. They just want to be happy. They just want to, be in a world in which they can continue to have that old relationship they had with the U.S. Let me give a cynical answer to your question as what the U.S. wanted. And it goes back to what I said earlier on. There's several different policies being pursued at the same time. And I think part of it is actually deliberate in the sense that Trump likes that type of chaos. And if he's the ultimate decision maker, chaos gives him an edge. Those who don't have the agency of making decisions will be at a disadvantage in a scenario in which he, by definition, has more information than the others. But what I think is this, what happened is this. Trump, first of all, didn't dislike the nuclear deal because he, was moonlighting as a nuclear physicist and he really didn't like the science behind this. No. He didn't like it because it was Obama's deal, but he also was something concrete in the deal that he didn't like. And he actually talked about here on the campaign trail, but very few people have paid attention to. Which was that he said, the Iranians are going to get $150 billion, completely false, not true at all, but anyways. And what do you think they're going to do with that money? Well, they're going to buy things from the Europeans. They're not going to buy it from us. Well, the reason why he said that, and the reason why that to a large extent was true, was because the deal actually only lifted secondary sanctions, meaning sanctions that the US imposes on other countries if they trade with Iran. Not sanctions, we didn't lift sanctions, the primary sanctions, which are the sanctions you impose on American companies if they trade with Iran. So American companies, such as Trump Tower, could not build towers in Tehran under the nuclear deal, whereas the Europeans and the Asians and others could. And he was really upset about this. And so were a lot of other people in the business community. Once he gets into office, though, he surrounds himself with people who discover, to their horror, that he actually is opposed to the Iran deal for all the wrong reasons. That he actually had no particular hatred or baggage with Iran in any way, shape, or form. He had no clue about the regional activities or why we should be opposed to them or anything like that. He disliked it for a completely different reason. But some of the regional actors who were against the nuclear deal, which essentially is only three of them, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, quickly figured Trump out. And they did so during the campaign trail. They did so to the extent that Trump decided to do something that no one else had done. Instead of making his first trip Mexico or Canada, he went to Saudi Arabia. Never happened before. And there, they pushed his buttons. He didn't like the nuclear deal, well, they hated the nuclear deal. Because the nuclear deal had nothing to do with the nuclear details. The nuclear deal signaled that the US and Iran are going to be embarking on a process of slowly but surely getting over their now quite outdated enmity and try to be normal states. They'll still have problems with each other, but this excessive degree of enmity is no longer in anyone's interest. And now finally they had found an opening, which I called the process of losing an enemy. And this did not go down well in Saudi Arabia, or did not go down well in Israel, because while America has friends, what America doesn't understand is that America's friends oftentimes don't want America to have more friends. They want to be the friends. And so they saw an opportunity with someone who already disliked the deal to push for him to go against it. He saw an opportunity because as soon as he senses that someone wants something from him, he starts thinking dollar signs. What are they willing to pay for it? And essentially the Saudis and the Israelis sold Trump the idea that if you go for maximum pressure, if Obama had just continued his sanctions for another 6 months, the Iranian economy would have collapsed, they said. Which incidentally I think is completely false, and I think it's been proven by now. But he said if you do that, they will come crawling, they will capitulate, you'll get a better deal, you'll have your name on it, and you will go down as the best president since the emergence of the universe. Now, they knew that this would not work. They knew quite well that this would not work. But they calculated that it would escalate to the point in which the Iranians would respond militarily at some point, and then the US would go and bomb Iran, which was their end objective. And what ended up playing out wrongly is that once the Iranians did that, they called Trump's bluff, as Steve said, because the US was not willing to go that route. Because I don't think Trump actually ever wanted to go to war. He wanted to show that he's the boss, that he's the bully, and that he could get a better deal than Obama by simply not giving anything more, but giving less, and just squeezing the Iranians. So the two sides from the outset were kind of playing each other. They were never on the same page. They had different calculations. And the whole thing came falling apart now. And I think the Saudi-Israeli hope of being able to get to that point is now more or less over, not only because of what Trump has done, but because he fired Bolton, because Mandalkar left OFAC, and many, many other people that are now left, who were the people around Trump that was constantly pushing him in this direction. And when push came to shove, and they had to counsel him on whether to go to war or not, Bolton counseled going to war. Pompeo counseled to go to war. And according to the press, Bolton was devastated when he heard that Trump had reversed his decision and decided not to go to war. That's when this whole thing fell apart.
Oh, I was just going to, well, why don't we go on to another question? No, I was going to say, just to, again, expanding slightly on what you just heard, I have a slightly different metaphor, which should be easy for Massachusetts people to understand. The American policy has been to sort of keep Iran in the penalty box for as long as possible, not let it to be part of the hockey game any longer. And that, of course, is the objective that the Saudis and the Israelis and some others in the region have wanted. So Iran would be marginal. The problem is that by itself is an engine of regional conflict. Iran, in order to get out of the penalty box, has relied upon its various clients and partners in various ways as a way of reminding everybody, we're in the region, we're 80 million people, you cannot ignore us. You cannot simply put us to one side. So it's been driving much of the regional conflicts, is this long effort to keep Iran in the penalty box. And as Trita said, the JCPOA was the first step to starting to let Iran out. The question was sort of, where are the Europeans on this one? The Europeans would actually like to let Iran out too, because they want to lower the temperature overall in the Middle East, partly for commercial reasons, partly because conflict in the Middle East has a direct effect on Europe through the flow of refugees, terrorism, and a variety of other things, in ways it does not affect the United States. So the European objective apart from keeping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, is also to try and ameliorate all of these regional conflicts. And to do that, you have to let Iran out of the penalty box. You have to start treating it like it's a member of the international community, that it has a right to be involved in regional negotiations on Syria and other things, because these are issues that directly affect it. And that's, I think, the sort of the bigger diplomatic picture that's been behind it. Of course, the Trump administration, went back to the policy of trying to keep them in the box and got more conflict. My last point, it's very interesting. In the last few weeks, you've suddenly seen some hints that some Saudis and Gulf states are beginning to recognize that they need to restart some kind of diplomatic process with Iran as well. That maximum pressure and confrontation isn't working well for them, let alone the effect it's having on our position and on Iran itself.
So let's continue to focus on Saudi Arabia. After the attack against the oil facilities in Saudi, the Trump administration sent a few hundred troops to the kingdom, but the administration didn't really do much else in response. What does that response tell you about U.S. dependence on Middle East oil and gas, and about U.S. security commitments to not just Saudi Arabia, but the other oil-rich monarchies in that region?
I think, although the United States does not depend to any significant degree on Middle East oil at this point, we're essentially energy independent, and just as a footnote, still too reliant on fossil fuels. But the flow of Middle East oil and gas to the rest of the world is still pretty central to the world economy. So if you cut all of that off, right, then it has very significant effects on other countries that import oil, on Japan, on China, on others as well. And that, of course, then has a big effect on the American economy. As Trita said, you end up with a big recession here in the United States. So in that sense, keeping oil flowing out the Strait of Hormuz is an American interest, because it ultimately ties into our economy, even though we don't depend on oil from the region. That's going to change, I think, over time as people do reduce fossil fuel dependence over the next 20, 30, 40 years, in part because we're going to be more capable of production. We're going to be providing liquefied natural gas to others as well. But it hasn't disappeared, and I believe if there was a really serious existential threat to that flow of oil, the United States would act. That what's happened in the Gulf so far has not been at a level that requires an American response, but we have responded previously, say during the Iran-Iraq War, when there was attacks being made on oil tankers. The United States responded by organizing flotillas and convoys and guarding them. So I think we might do something like that in the future if there were a genuine threat to the flow of oil. Yeah, I don't know if you have a different view on that.
No, I would just add one thing. I think that moment may be coming a little bit sooner than we may have projected, because the attack against Aramco facilities took out 5% of the world oil production for about 3 weeks. And the reaction on the oil market was a 19% jump of oil prices for the first day and a half, and then it just went back to normal. And that's probably to a very large extent because the US used its strategic reserve, but it does show then that, again, the oil is already becoming less important. We have other ways of stabilizing the oil market, far short of doing anything militarily, frankly.
Just one quick. Of course, if you were really worried about the supply of oil and gas in the world, you could lift sanctions on Iran.
Yeah. This was actually my second point.
Oh, okay, sorry.
When you look at the last 25 or so years, whenever there actually has been a real threat to the flow of oil in the Persian Gulf, it's been because of the US policy. In this case, you have maximum pressure. There were no attacks against any tankers in the Persian Gulf or any oil facilities in Saudi Arabia prior to this. We had some problems, of course, as a result of the US invasion of Iraq, which was a war of choice that had no legal or other moral basis. So if we're really concerned about the flow of oil, there's a lot we can do to make sure that we don't create situations in which the flow would be threatened.
But what
does that say to Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries in terms of the US security commitments to their defense, the fact that there was such a lack of response?
There are no US commitments to Saudi Arabia. I mean, there is no treaty for us to protect the House of Saud. There is no such thing. The fact that the public narrative is such in which a premise of the conversation is that we do have such a commitment is quite
But doesn't
crazy.
Saudi Arabia have that sense that they will come to our defense?
Could I just jump in
From
with a counterfactual? What if Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait today? Are you arguing, both of you, that the US would not respond the way it did in 1990-91?
Well, let's take a couple of things. First of all, that is a full-scale invasion. That is a violation of international law. That is something that went to the UN Security Council, and the Security Council gave a UN mandate. We're talking here about a scenario without a UN mandate and without an AUMF from Congress. Apparently, the president is supposed to do something. No, not at all. Moreover, if we are going to behave in such a manner in which we're feeling this obligation to go and protect countries that we don't have treaties with, then what's the value of a treaty? Why should we strike these treaties if we're going to act as if we have to step in? Now, it's a different story if there had been an invasion, and there had been a UN process, and there had been a UN Security Council resolution, and an international coalition was put together, and the US would be part of it or would be leading it. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a situation in which there was no invasion, it was an attack. The attack could have been as a response to Saudi Arabia's 4 years war in Yemen, in which they had more or less obliterated that country, or it could be a response to the maximum pressure strategy, which the Saudis have been a major force behind. Moreover, no AUMF, no legal process, nothing. And this is again where I think we have just jumped over so many of the different procedural steps that otherwise not only would have been commonplace, but the Bush senior administration insisted on going through those different steps and went through a very intense and taxing diplomatic process in order to put together a real coalition in order to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Now we think that we can just instantaneously do so through a tweet, and we normalize that in our own minds in a way that we are not even aware of these legal processes that need to take place.
Are you going to respond at all? Okay, so we're just going to move right along just so that we have time for the audience to also ask their questions. So I will perhaps make this the last question that perhaps Sohail and I ask. So moving on to Israel and Palestine. Earlier this year, Jared Kushner sort of convened the Bahrain conference and sort of proposed the economic dimension of his vision of a peace process there. It was a very lackluster affair. The Palestinians boycotted it, and the Israelis were then asked not to come to the conference because the Palestinians weren't there. And now Kushner is supposed to introduce the political component of his vision now that the Israeli election is over. How do you see the US administration's sort of seriousness when it comes to addressing the issue in Israel and Palestine?
I really shouldn't be so cynical at my elderly age or getting up there, but no, this is it's a sham. The whole peace process that Jared Kushner has been supposedly running is basically a gigantic smokescreen designed to simply have there be no progress, no genuine negotiation, no anything, and certainly no slowdown in the gradual Israeli encroachment into the West Bank. The purpose of this is to facilitate the creation of a greater Israel. That's what it's there for. That's why they're doing it. But they have to pretend that they're doing something and that this utterly unqualified, not very successful real estate developer who happened to marry the president's daughter is going to be the diplomatic genius who suddenly comes up with something that pulls off a remarkable diplomatic coup, one that's evaded the talents of a whole lot of much smarter and more skillful diplomats than he. So I find this remarkable that anyone took this seriously at all. if you saw who the Trump administration appointed as ambassador to Israel, who they have made their Middle East envoy, and who they handed the peace process to, it was quite clear that this was a sham from the very beginning and should be called that.
Thank you.
I'll get off the fence soon.
This is actually a good example of what we talked about earlier on, that, he's just exaggerating policies that we've had in place for some time. Because the peace process has only been alive in Washington. For the last 15 or so years, it's been dead in the region, it's been dead everywhere, it's been dead on the ground. But in Washington, the political cost of admitting that it's dead is too high, so everyone is just pretending as if it's still alive, and it's not. The change is that the effort to come up with some sort of a sham is just become less and less is being invested into it. Because this time around, they really didn't even bother to try to make it convincing. But there's also an element in which there seems to be a belief among some of them that, you can just buy off the Palestinians. That you can just give them some economic development and then they will be fine. And I think this actually creates a bit of a challenge for IR theorists, because I think within IR theory, I've yet come across a really good theory that explains, okay, how do you fit in this concept of human dignity into these things, and to understand that that is a factor that you have to take into account. Because human dignity is going to ensure that there's not going to be a solution to this problem that is just based on one side saying, okay, we're just going to buy you off. You're not going to get back your land. You're not going to have a state, but you're going to have really nice apartments. It's just not going to work.
I want to connect that to some other things we've talked about. You say, why do the Palestinians want a state? Well, look at the Kurds. Look what's happened to the Kurds. They have no state. There are millions of Kurds. They're in a bunch of other states where they're usually not treated particularly well. If you don't have a state, you have no organization, no coherent entity. This is where Zionism came from, the idea that Jews were going to be at risk if they didn't have a state. Same impulse. Why are the Rohingya in Myanmar in trouble? Because they don't have a state. Exactly. So you can understand why the Palestinians, particularly given what's happened to them over the last century, would like a state of their own. Right? And therefore to say, here's a nice apartment, but you're still going to be completely under our thumb. You'll have no real security. Right? We can come in to your areas anytime we want to. We'll control the electromagnetic spectrum around you, so we'll control your communications, we'll be able to monitor anything. But you'll have really nice apartments. We'll even give you, thousands of dollars every year. That's not going to work, because if you don't have security, all of those things can be taken away from you. Right? So they would like to have their own state. Unfortunately, in my opinion, they're not going to get one, because the incorporation of the West Bank has gone too far now. So you're going to end up with a one-state solution. Not because that's a good outcome, it's actually not a good outcome, but two states was going to be hard too, but one state's ultimately going to be worse, and it will eventually lead, as former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert said, back in I think 2006 or 2007, if the two-state solution fails, we will eventually face a Palestinian struggle for political and civil rights. It will be like South Africa. Right?
And it'll end up as a Palestinian one state.
And it says once that happens, the state of Israel is finished. This is Ehud Olmert talking. Ehud Barak, by the way, said similar things as well. Now, I don't think you end up with a Palestinian one state. I think you end up with a binational state. I'll be long gone by the time this happens. And that's not going to work very well. Right? Binational states often don't work particularly well, particularly if there's a history of enmity between the two peoples, etc. But that's where we're going. I think where we're headed. And as Trita said, it's the thing you never hear anybody really say in Washington, because they want to cling to the two-state fig leaf as long as possible. Because once we admit that two states isn't going to happen, then you ask yourself, what's American policy? What are we in favor of? Are we in favor of one person, one vote in Greater Israel? Sounds like America, right? We are not supposed to pay attention to religion, ethnicity, background, things like that. One person, one vote? That's a very different Israel than the one we've had. Are we in favor of apartheid, little tiny Palestinian communities that are surrounded by the Israelis and controlled by them. I don't think that sounds very much like America either, right? And so that's hard to support. Are we in favor of expulsion? Well, we're just going to have to deal with it, shove them out into Jordan. That's called ethnic cleansing, and it's a crime against humanity. So once you give up the two-state fig leaf, you're left with a series of not very attractive options. Right? And unfortunately, that I believe is where we're going to end up here, in part because America screwed up its chances to bring this to an end back in the 1990s when I think it was within reach. Sorry, end of sermon.
Thank you.
Do you want me to get the last question, or are we going to move on?
So I think we can ask just the last question and
Okay,
then we
sure.
open it up to the audience.
This is a really simple question. With Donald,
Not very simple question. This
right.
is not a very
It'll
simple
take only 1 minute for each of them. With Donald Trump facing impeachment and the country heading into the presidential election, can we expect less U.S. engagement with the Middle East, as has often been the case in presidential elections? And if that happens, do you see Russia and China making further inroads into the region?
I'll be really quick. I actually think, again, maybe somewhat contrarianly, that impeachment is kind of irrelevant here. And the reason I say it, we have essentially a comatose, failing Middle East policy already. And the fact that now he's going to be preoccupied with impeachment and not able to do very much is not going to suddenly impair a policy that is already not very good, not very effective, not very coherent. So I don't think it's really going to have much impact. There is a caveat there. It's possible that if the impeachment process proceeds and he's looking like he's in increasingly hot water, that you'll get some kind of foreign policy Hail Mary, right? And people talk about a wag the dog war. He suddenly calls up Rouhani. The NSA gets Rouhani's home phone number, and Trump gets him on the line somehow and says, you can have everything you... I don't know what form it would take. He decides he's going to fly to Pyongyang and do a deal with... You might get some kind of Hail Mary in the Middle East. I don't know what form it might take. But by and large, I think actually impeachment is going to be kind of irrelevant to what we actually do in the Middle East, because we don't have much of a policy already, and we're not going to get one while the president is scrambling around trying to figure out how not to be removed from office.
What about Putin? Do you see Putin taking...
I'll let Trita handle the China and Russia part.
Yeah, so China, Russia, and others are increasing their presence and influence in the region. They are, however, not anywhere close to establishing anything even remotely resembling hegemony there. Part of the reason for that is because they're smart enough to know that you don't want hegemony in the Middle East. I would not wish hegemony on the Middle East to my worst enemy. Why would anyone? We're the only ones who are terrified about giving up the illusion of our hegemony in the region. There's no benefit that comes to that at this point. This is not a region that is as strategically significant as it was before. That's not to say that it's unimportant, but it comes with a tremendous amount of headache. And the US is extremely ill-equipped to resolve those problems, so it becomes a sunk hole in which we're just throwing resources and getting nothing for it, nor is the region getting anything for it. We are clearly moving towards a scenario in the region in which it's going to be operating as if the entire globe is now multipolar. And in some ways, I think actually that may not be so bad. Just take a look at what Steve mentioned earlier on. As soon as the Saudis realized that their belief that the US was going to come to their aid, as long as they believed in our false promises that we were going to secure them, a promise we should never have given. As long as that was the case, they had no interest in sitting down with the Iranians and talking. As soon as they realized that the US is not going to do so, they're not going to defend, they're not going to wage a war on behalf of Saudi Arabia, they started sending signals to the Iranians of finding a way to sit down and talk and have diplomacy. It's an example that shows that when our military posture is such that we actually give these allies the impression that we will take care of the problems for them, it will ensure that not only do they not take care of their own problems, they don't want to have their problems resolved diplomatically. They prefer to have a scenario in which the US military resolves it for them. So US military hegemony in the region has been an obstacle to diplomatic solutions in many cases. Saudi Arabia could have sat down with the Iranians last year, the year before, and the year before that. They kept on rejecting those opportunities. And I understand that they're in a weak position. The Iranians are winning. So as long as they thought that there was some hope that they could get the US to bomb Iran, that was always preferable to diplomacy. But the deal they can get now with Iran is much worse than the one that they could have gotten 2 years ago. Because after 4.5 years of fighting against a rebel force in Yemen, they've gained absolutely nothing. Even the Saudi population is now starting to turn against the war. And on top of that, it's now also been revealed that $80 billion of spending on American weaponry does not mean that the Iranians cannot hit your oil fields. So they're in a very bad situation, and they should have been much smarter and opted for diplomacy much, much earlier.
First, so that concludes the first part of our event today. So please join me in thanking both our speakers. And normally what we do at this point is to sort of, to ask our audience to break up into small groups, etc. We will not do that today because we have this amazing expertise and we'd love for you to engage with them directly and as much as possible. So whoever would like to ask the first question, please make it brief, and I will. Morty?
Going back to the beginning.
How far is that?
That's Syria and Turkey. Now, up until this point, when it comes to both domestic and foreign policy, Trump has basically been acting as Putin's agent. Now, it's a safe assumption that the Turks and the Russians have some kind of entente that will allow this incursion into northern Syria. Is Trump acting as Putin's agent here too?
We have one mic now. First of all, I am not one of those who believes that Vladimir Putin has something on the president, right? That he is somehow a paid, bought, blackmailed, whatever, coerced person. I think that he's, what Lenin used to call a useful idiot from Russia's perspective. He's done various things that have made life easier for Putin. He's also ended up doing some things that made life harder for Putin as well. I think the key to understanding at least the Russian role in Syria and other parts of the Middle East gets back to something Judah said. They had very modest objectives, right, that were well within their means. What was the Russian goal in Syria? Keep Assad in power, full stop. They had no other objective, just keep Assad in power. The only ally they had left in the Middle East, they wanted to preserve that, and that turned out to be relatively easy to do. What was the American objective in Syria? Get Assad out of power, get the Iranians out of Syria, not allow ISIS to gain power, not allow Al-Qaeda or its various brethren to gain power, try to find a few Syrian liberal Democrats who would, small d Democrats there, who would be able to then run Syria. People, by the way, who largely did not exist. We had an impossibly contradictory set of objectives.
And turn Syria into Switzerland.
Enter Syria into Switzerland. That was the American objective, which we were never going to reach, right? And so one of the reasons the Russians were successful is they had a feasible goal that was well within their means. We had an impossible set of goals that we could never have accomplished. And in a sense, again, it gets back to where we started, Trump at some level kind of recognized this. I think he did it sort of intuit that we were there without any particular purpose. And he doesn't understand the politics. He has no appreciation for the diplomacy of it as well. So he wanted to find a way to sort of get us out of this whole mess. It's not going to turn the place over to Russia. Russia's not going to be able to run Syria either. Russia has enough trouble running Russia right now. But So I don't view this as so much a victory for Putin as just a series of mistakes by the United States that predate Trump, in fact.
If I can just add, I'm not convinced that the Russians are thrilled by what Turkey is doing. The Iranians have come out pretty strongly against it. What they would want was something that we apparently discouraged the Kurds from doing, which is that the Kurds should negotiate with Assad and come to some sort of agreement with Assad, and as a result, deprive the Turks from the pretext of saying that they're going to be using Syrian territory in order to be able to potentially do attacks against Turkey. And this is one of the things, if the United States has relations with these Kurds, it's not a particularly deep or long one. We have to keep that in mind. Many of these organizations, or the core of this organization, was on the US terrorist list just up until a couple of years ago. But we have relations with them, and we have relations with Syria, with Turkey, and as a result, the United States could have and should have negotiated all along in order to be able to come to some sort of a solution that would allow the United States to leave without leading to this type of a scenario. Again, we didn't invest in the diplomacy, we didn't think of that as worthwhile, we didn't even think of that as an activity. Instead, the only real variables we're dealing with is how many troops do we have here, how many do we move over here, etc. And with that type of an approach, we're going to leave chaos. And it's important to recognize that is not an inevitable outcome. That's an outcome that comes as a result of us doing things in a very, very foolish manner, particularly a manner in which we do not give diplomacy any chance whatsoever.
Cheryl, and then Mark.
Thank you very much for your wisdom and analysis of this complicated area. I'm an advocate of Palestinian rights, and so I'm very interested in your comments, Mr. Walt, about discarding any solution besides a two-state solution as a good outcome, especially about your comment about the one state, well, all of the other solutions you found not so desirable. Why wouldn't a one-state solution with equal rights for both sides be a reasonable or desirable outcome, even though it may take 50 or 100 years to get there?
Yeah, let me be clear. I think it would be a wonderful outcome if you could find a way to pull it off. But first of all, it's going to take a couple of generations to even, I think, get there, because the Israelis have no desire to share their state with on those terms, and they're going to go to enormous lengths to prevent that from happening. And that's going to involve a lot of human suffering of various kinds. So the Palestinian struggle for just political and civil rights is not going to be a gentle process. Again, think South Africa again. Convincing the apartheid regime, the white government in South Africa, to give up the reins involved a lot of violence. It involved a lot of suffering. So it's not like this is all going to get worked out amongst amicable parties. And then secondly, I would love to think that at some point down the road there might be a binational state with all the inhabitants of a greater Israel enjoying political rights. But if I look around the world at places where there are two or more different ethnic groups in the same polity, a lot of these countries do not work very well, right? There's lots of rivalries, there's lots of suspicion. Look what's happening in India now, right? Hundreds of millions of Muslims now at some risk in India as it veers in the direction of the Hindu population as well. And when there's a history, as there is in the case of the Israelis and Palestinians, of lots of trouble going back a century or so, the idea that they're all suddenly going to say, you know, this was all a huge mistake, we all want to live happily together, I think it's just unrealistic to expect it. So I'm not, I think that's where we're going to end up. I'm not particularly happy about it, and I hope it works, and I hope, you know, the parties involved and those who are interested in that part of the world can try and shape it in a positive direction. But I think it's going to be a very difficult process to get there, and even once there, it's not going to be an easy polity to manage in the foreseeable future. I take no pleasure in saying any of that.
So first of all, I think it's really refreshing to hear people talk and speak intelligently about policy. And that brings me to 3 quick questions. The first is, so we keep referring to, and you keep referring to Trump's decisions. Is anybody else involved in these decisions at this point, is my first question. The second question is, who could be involved in these decisions that are being made? And the third is, God willing, there's going to be an election soon. What should we be looking for in a candidate who will do well on international policy?
Mm.
You want to go first?
Yeah, it's that last one that really is the tough one. I mean, we actually don't know an enormous amount that's really solid and reliable about the decision-making process in the White House. What has come out from various people who have left, who have talked to journalists, is that it's sort of chaos. That there are people who have tried to impose a certain degree of order and a certain degree of process, and sometimes they succeed. That there are points where they can sort of get Trump to corralled and get him to listen for a little while. To here's what you need to say, here's what you need to do, but it's an uphill fight. That the White House staff does live in fear that he'll watch something on Fox and Friends and tweet something off, and that will then suddenly be the thing they have to run around and explain what he meant by it, or what it really means, or what implications that has for policy. So there is, I think, a sense of which we don't have a full picture, but a sense that this is kind of a train wreck of a policy-making process, which is why, of course, this is also an administration that has so few foreign policy successes. It's hard to think of any really substantial one, despite enormous amounts of effort devoted to a number of different processes as well. In terms of what we should be looking for, I think, personally, I don't want Joe Biden, because I think if you have Joe Biden, you have essentially reversion to the foreign policy of what Hillary's administration would have been and what the Obama administration would have been, which is still the United States sort of involved trying to run the world. And Obama was a sort of kindler, gentler way of trying to run the world, but it was still, the United States is trying to solve lots of local problems everywhere. And that's, I think, didn't work very well for Obama. And he was very smart and really worked hard at the job. So I would like someone who had a slightly more restrained-oriented approach. I haven't seen that yet. Sometimes Bernie sounds that way, but I have enormous respect for Bernie's principal foreign policy advisor, a man named Matt Duss, who's very good, first rate. But I don't think Bernie Sanders, I hope I'm not treading anybody's toes, I don't think Bernie Sanders is going to be the nominee, and I don't think he'd be a very good president. Among other things, he is the second least popular member of the Senate. Senate, right? You know the first? Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz. It doesn't play well, has never passed a significant piece of legislation in his entire Senate career, does not play well with others, and remember, he's not even a member of the Democratic Party. Right, so I don't think he'd be a very good president. And he's the most restrained, apart from Tulsi Gabbard, who's not going to get the nomination either. Right, so I think you're down to sort of who's left. Biden's possibility, Warren, who hasn't said very much about foreign policy in detail. She said some good things that have been encouraging. A lot of it will also depend on who the president appoints and to what positions. And with the exception of Sanders, and again, Gabbard, I think almost all of the other Democratic nominees, if they get the nomination, they're going to be inclined to pull a lot of familiar faces. Basically, people who worked in the Obama administration are going to come back in, because you can't run an administration without people. And the people who've had these jobs before are going to flow back into them. You'll see Susan Rice come back. You'll see Samantha Power come back. You'll see, I think that's reasonably likely, or people like them. If it's Joe Biden, Colin Powell, who I think very highly of, is out at Stanford, he'll come back in as well. You'll get the democratic foreign policy establishment, and a lot of them are my friends, a lot of them are smart, but they are people who are really deeply imbued with the belief that the United States has to be out there solving every one of the world's problems all the time. And that hasn't worked particularly well over the last 25 years, and I don't think it would work particularly well. So I'm looking for a candidate who comes into this with even more skepticism than Barack Obama had, and he had a lot. I'll stop there.
Let me just add one word.
Steve, could you pass the mic?
Oh, sorry.
I'm a bit less cynical, or not cynical, pessimistic than Steve on this, because I do sense a realization amongst a lot of former Obama people that they had a lot of missed opportunities, that Obama could have done more, and that at a second go they may try a little bit harder in a restraint-oriented direction. I would really like to see the candidates start talking about America's role in such a way that they start questioning and dismantling some of the first principles that has underpinned everything, whether you are a John McCain or whether you are a George Bush or Barack Obama. The idea, for instance, that American leadership means American military hegemony. These are two concepts that need to be decoupled. America can show a tremendous amount of leadership without military hegemony. In fact, our military hegemony and military adventurism has been to the detriment of American leadership. But these things need to start to be discussed and decoupled at that very high level. Because without some of those principles and ideas of what we are, we're going to go back into the path dependency of what we have done for the last 25 years with a naive expectation that we're going to reach different results. The only reason why we may reach different results is because we're getting weaker and weaker and we have less and less capability to even win some of the minor victories that have been won. But a lot of these politicians are terrified of the idea that they're going to come across as if they're isolationists, that they're withdrawing from the world, etc. And a lot of that is because we have defined our leadership in such military terms, instead of recognizing that a small country like Sweden, with no military that anyone is particularly afraid of. In fact, the top military objective they have is to make sure that if the Russians invade, they will slow the Russians down with 1 week. That's their top line agenda ambition. They've had a tremendous amount of leadership on a whole set of different issues, from development to gender equality to other things. And there's a tremendous amount that the US can do as well that does not necessitate this degree of military domination around the world.
I'm sorry, I now have a better answer having listened to Judah. Here's the questions you should be asking as you watch the candidates. Which one of them answers, what are our strategic interests? What parts of the world really matter to the United States and why? And I think some of them do. What are the issues that require that do require American leadership? I think climate change, by the way, is one of them. I think you don't get progress on that issue if the United States is not on the right side of it and working pretty hard on it. But that's just my view. Then finally, what's the relationship between force and diplomacy? I mean, we're not going to be a militarily weak power, but can we use our influence in other ways as well? I want answers to those questions, not just the usual cliches about American primacy, American leadership, America as number one, America as exceptional. Those are just cliches people use to avoid talking about more concrete issues.
Wasn't it the military who
Just one
demanded?
second. Morty, I'm just going to do
Yes, sir.
So Debbie, and then Carolyn, and then I think you.
I'm impressed you guys are all on a first name basis.
They're a lot of my friends.
My question is really, what do you see as the United States' role in providing humanitarian assistance? I'm thinking in particular of Syria, where more than 500,000 people have died, where we have there's a terrible mass killing going on. What do you see as America's role in being helpful, if you will? Second question, which is not really quite related, is just given this
shift by Trump recently around Kurds, what do you see as the potential for the resurgence of ISIS? And is that a threat to the U.S.?
The United States, given its power, should be prepared under certain conditions to use its military to prevent humanitarian disasters, mass killings and genocides, things like that. But I set the bar relatively high for that. One, you have to be really confident that something like a mass killing is going to happen. Second, you have to believe you have military options that will bring it to an end in a reasonable amount of time. And third, very importantly, you're confident that you're not going to make things worse. And I believe in the case of Syria, which was truly an awful situation, the United States mishandled that very badly even before the Civil War really got going, right, for a variety of reasons I won't get into. But once it was clear that a major humanitarian disaster was taking place, and there was lots of pressure for us to create no-fly zones or maybe intervene or topple Assad or bomb his forces or whatever, I believe Barack Obama made the judgment that if he did those things, you might end the killing, but you might actually make things worse. And clearly what was in the back of his mind at that point was Libya, where we went in to, quote, allegedly to prevent a possible mass killing in Benghazi. We then went a little beyond our original mission and decided to help the rebels overthrow Gaddafi, and what we got was anarchy. And of course, it turns out the only thing worse than a really despotic, awful government is no government at all when you have a bunch of contending groups and warlords and whatever. And I think Obama made the judgment on Syria that if we went in and overthrew Assad, we would end up with anarchy, even worse than in Libya, with a lot of very bad actors around. Now that's a debatable point. Reasonable people can disagree about that, but that was the judgment he made, and that's sort of where I would come down. On ISIS, I never thought ISIS was an existential threat to the United States. Very dangerous for the people in the areas that it controlled. Some problems for neighboring countries, a relatively minor problem for the United States. It also managed to emerge and control a vast swath of territory in some very unusual circumstances created in the aftermath of the Iraq War. I don't believe those special circumstances are going to reemerge. So yes, ISIS is going to be around. It will have influence in certain places. It will continue to do nefarious things in various sorts, but I don't think it poses an existential threat to the United States, and I wouldn't keep American troops there solely for that purpose.
Okay, add a couple of points. 2 points on Syria. We had diplomatic opportunities early on in that conflict. And I remember I was in Washington, D.C. Everyone thought Assad is going to fall in a week. And as a result, anyone saying, hey, let's look at diplomacy, let's see if there can be a negotiated solution. That was the option of giving Assad an undeserved lifeline, because the assumption, without much basis, was, oh, he's going to fall in a week. So we lost a lot of opportunities there that could have saved tons of lives of having pushed for that instead of, frankly, preventing diplomacy from taking place, because diplomacy was seen as something that would have saved Assad. Now, Assad is still there, and 500,000 people are dead. Secondly, on Syria, it's also important to keep in mind that a large part of the territory that the Kurds currently control are not traditionally Kurdish territories. These are territories that have fallen under Kurdish control as a result of the civil war and the retreat of the Syrian state. The populations there tend to be Sunni Arab. If the US was still there and allowing the Kurds to control that territory, you could actually see a potential resurgence of ISIS there as a reaction to the Sunni Arabs being under Kurdish control. What I'm trying to say is that this is really complicated, and if we're not up to, if we don't have the skill set to handle these things, let's get out of the way. Instead of thinking that we know how to resolve these things, well, we clearly don't, because it's tremendously tricky and highly complicated. There was one more point. There was another question. What was the last question you?
It was just around
Humanitarian assistance.
Oh, the last one was on ISIS. One big difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS that made ISIS more dangerous is that a lot of the folks that ended up fighting and doing horrible terrorist acts for Al-Qaeda were trained by Al-Qaeda. They were called the travelers. People in different places that went to Afghanistan and other places, got training, and then returned. With ISIS, something else happened. And that was that they were just sitting in front of YouTube. And they were radicalized there, and then suddenly they may never have left the country that they committed their terrorist act in, and yet they did. So the idea as to whether ISIS holds a piece of territory in Syria or elsewhere, that actually is an indication of its potency to be able to pose a terrorist threat elsewhere in the world, the correlation simply is not there. That doesn't mean that it's good that they do so, but to believe that if we prevent them from doing so, it has eliminated that terrorist threat is simply not true.
So, I'm going back a little in the conversation where it felt as if politically astute people could talk about pulling back from using military and having wise political decisions. And it feels a little closed circuit to me because we're leaving out the arms industry. And they're enormous. And we have administrations that give IOUs to countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia to buy arms here. And I can't believe that some of the military decisions aren't influenced by the need to use these arms and the pressure. I don't know exactly how it works. I had a cousin who worked for the Israeli Defense Forces who would come to arms shows annually here and buy things from American companies for the Israeli military. I don't know how easy it is. I'd like you to speak to the role of these industries in our being free to make foreign policy with wisdom.
Yeah, you get started and I'll back clean up.
That's a great question. It's extremely important. It is a major, major factor. It's one of those factors that were somewhat hidden, but of course not a secret, and Trump has made sure that it's completely out in the open. Making it clear that the basis of the relationship with Saudi Arabia is that they spend money on our arms. But I think there's also something extremely dangerous in making in our own minds these various factors, these various entities into invincible actors. Because once you do that, and I'm not saying that you did that, I'm just going to kind of extrapolate on your point a little bit. If we do that, it's essentially disempowering ourselves, because it means there's nothing we can do. And there are plenty of examples in which we see that that is not only incorrect, it's actually quite false. August 2013, Obama decides that he's not going to go into Syria without congressional approval. And suddenly there was an opportunity for the American public to have a say in it. And this came out of nowhere, but people quickly organized. And the phone calls to congressional offices on this issue, right or wrong, you can be on any side of this issue, I'm just pointing out what the numbers were. Roughly 97% of the phone calls were from people saying, do not go into Syria, against the administration's position to take military action. Congress was completely overwhelmed. And it wasn't just the administration that was ferociously lobbying in favor of the decision. So was the arms industry, so was the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. But they got, all three of them, extremely powerful, got beaten down pretty bad by the American public. And Congress decided not to vote in favor. What it shows is that these special interests that we oftentimes speak of as if they're invincible are only invincible in the absence of the American public being engaged. When the American public is engaged, then we actually get a clearer picture that they're very narrow special interests that win because the other side oftentimes doesn't show up for the fight. They're organized and they're mobilized on a regular basis. Whereas the American public spends too much time watching the Kardashians and only every once in a while gets involved in these issues. But when they do, their power is overwhelming. If enough resources and effort can be made towards mobilizing the American public on these issues, not at the level that was happening August 2013, because that's very, very difficult, but at a slightly higher level than what it is right now, on a more regular basis, you could see a dramatic shift in the politics of these issues.
Yeah, a great question, and I think underappreciated. Let me say a couple things. First of all, it's worth remembering that the defense industry in the United States is a steadily shrinking share of the U.S. economy. Right? It's not actually that large a chunk of the American economy, which I think is a good thing. Second, the American military, uniformed military, in my view, is not particularly hawkish, not particularly pro-war. They don't like going to war. It's painful. It gets their soldiers killed, etc. Once in, they also don't like to lose. One of the things presidents have to understand is that once you send the military off to do a task, they do not want to come home until they think they've accomplished it. They're not necessarily the ones who are pushing you into it. Once you unleash them, right, they take on a slightly different character. The defense industry doesn't care that much whether there are wars going on or not, as long as they can sell their product. And that means they're in the business of mostly selling insecurity. They want us and they want other countries to feel scared, so they'll go out and buy the insurance that they're selling, which in this case is more weapons as well. And they do that in a variety of different ways. You'll see their ads in newspapers from different defense industries. They spend a lot of money funding think tanks in Washington that don't say overtly go out and buy the F-35, although sometimes they do, but they will say the world is a dangerous place, the United States needs to have the strongest military. They will sell this idea that we have to be everywhere, there are problems, there are dangers, there are threats, we are the answer to it as well. And then just to add to my answer on candidates, I'd also be looking forward to a candidate who talked openly and in simple phrases about the importance of peace. What's remarkable in the American political discourse now is you find very few candidates who talk about peace, how much they like it, how much they think it's desirable, how much they think peace is actually almost always in our interest. We're already in remarkable shape. The United States is relatively safe, relatively prosperous, relatively wealthy. The thing that could really screw things up for Americans is a big war someplace. Right? Peace is actually good for business, good for international trade, good for foreign investment, good for lots of things. A peaceful world is a really desirable world, and you would think American politicians would talk a lot about it. Understanding that sometimes the use of force is necessary, but as a last resort, not as a first impulse. So I'd like to see a candidate or two that would actually talk openly about the desirability of peace, the occasional necessity for war, but the desirability of peace. And there are two great speeches that I recommend to you. One, of course, is the famous Dwight D. Eisenhower farewell address, where he talks about the military-industrial complex. A five-star general who was no dove, pointing out the dangers of unwarranted influence from essentially the defense industry. But the other speech is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Chautauqua speech in, I think, 1935, where he talks about how much, I have seen war, I hate war. And he then unpacks this in remarkable detail, in rhetoric I've never heard a subsequent American president use, about why he thinks the position of the United States should be, whenever possible, to be in favor of peace. And it's not an idealistic speech. It's very clear about, there may be circumstances in which we have to depart from this position, but that's our starting point, right? And it's really a remarkable speech, so I would favor a candidate who could speak in words of plain English on that subject as well.
Thank you. So I guess I kind of have two questions. One, what you think the weight of the the Turkish president's promise to open borders will be, the weight of that will have within Europe and then subsequently on America in the coming weeks and months. And then I guess my second is we keep talking about a lot of the missed opportunities of diplomacy and a lot of the failures of the state. And I wonder what you guys see as possibilities for non-state actors to rise up and meet and maybe take advantage or help where the states are so obviously failing and or missing these opportunities, and what they can do towards peace, hopefully, what they can do to help where the state seems to keep lacking and keep failing over and over again, like we've been talking about.
I'll take, let me try to start with the second question first. I'm a realist, so I think states are still the most important political actors in the international system. They have most of the resources, they command loyalties, nationalism is a very powerful force, etc. That said, there are a whole series of moments where you see non-state actors having an influence, sort of batting above their weight. Famously, the Landmines Convention is sort of one famous example. It would not have come into being without some non-state actors getting organized, mobilized in a number of different countries, and then getting some state governments, Australia, Canada, and some others mobilized behind it using the UN system very effectively. In certain areas, other areas of global public health, private foundations have been very influential, and I think quite positively as well. So there are a whole series of issues, and to go back to something that Trita and I have both been involved in, if you looked at the debate in the Obama administration over the Iran nuclear deal, that was a debate which actually came close to what you want to have in a democracy, where you had a variety of different groups who were dead set opposed to the deal, and out there participating, going on the radio, going on TV, writing op-eds, doing all sorts of things to try and kill it. And you had another group of people in favor of it who were also well organized and actively engaged, and she really got a huge exchange of information and eventually led, in that case, to what I think was the right outcome. Well, and that was driven in large part by citizens getting involved, participating in it. I might add, by the way, the anti-deal groups were far more lavishly funded than the other groups, and they still lost because they were arguing a position that was really hard to sustain on a basis of logic and evidence, in my opinion. So I think the variety of non-state and citizens groups can have a really big impact, but it takes a lot of work.
So we have one last question, and then we're just going to close tonight.
Do you think that there's anything that the U.S. can do to make a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict more feasible?
I'll start with this one. This would definitely go against conventional wisdom in Washington, but the U.S. has made itself a party to this conflict. The U.S. getting out of the way actually would help, because it has thrown its weight behind one side in that conflict and provided it with almost complete immunity, to the point that as a candidate for the prime ministership, Netanyahu could make promises such as, I'm going to annex the Jordan Valley if you elect me. That is a complete violation of international law. It should be violation of US policy, to the extent that we are claiming to be in favor of a two-state solution. And the peacenik candidate, Gantz, who clearly is slightly less hawkish than Netanyahu, his campaign video was images of how he had turned Gaza into dust. So that's the competition you had on that side. And it's partly because we have created such walls of protection around Israel, in which pressure from outside world, or even the idea of pursuing a divestment and boycott campaign. And I'm personally not a big fan of sanctions per se, but nevertheless to argue that something that the US loves to do, on so many different cases that now suddenly in this case, it is not only a wrong thing, but it's illegal. And that it attempts to outlaw it. It tells us how far we have gone into tipping the scale on the side of one of these parties in that conflict, which is part of the reason why it's difficult to solve it. Sometimes you need a degree of balance of power between parties for them to both conclude that fighting is not going to be to their benefit and that they have to come to some form of a compromise. It was Kissinger himself who said of the Israelis back in 1973 that when they're strong, they don't want to, when they're weak, they don't want to compromise because they don't want to compromise from a position of weakness. When they're strong, they don't want to compromise because they're strong. Why would they have to compromise? And that's true for everyone. It's not just true for the Israelis or the Palestinians or others. But you need a degree of balance in order to make sure that compromise actually is seen as an attractive option for both sides. We have ensured that there is no balance because we have so much power and we've thrown it on the side of one of these parties. And we've seen the result of it. It's annexation. It's openly talking about violating international law as if it doesn't exist, which in fact it doesn't exist because they don't feel the consequences of violating the international law because we're making sure that they don't feel the consequences of it. This is bad for Israel, it's bad for the Palestinians, and it's certainly bad for the United States.
Yeah, the short answer is, in theory, the United States could do a lot. We could make the annual aid package conditional on a different Israeli approach to the conflict. We could tell our allies in other parts of the world that we no longer would pressure them not to be critical of Israel. We could support resolutions in the UN Security Council that were critical of Israel on this particular issue as well. So the whole variety of things that the United States could do. We could start suspending or slowing down the various forms of security cooperation that we undertake with the Israelis. All of which, not because we're mad at Israel or want to punish Israel, because that would be the way to get them. We, by the way, would still be putting lots of pressure on the Palestinians to reach an agreement as well, so we would be more even-handed. I wrote an entire book explaining why that's not going to happen, but in theory, it could. It is not, unfortunately, it is not clear to me any longer whether, if the United States were to do this in another universe, whether it would actually have the effect at this point, partly given the way Israeli domestic politics has evolved. So at this point, if the United States were to suddenly reverse course and start being a genuinely even-handed mediator, the Israelis might simply dig in their heels. And as we've talked about in other contexts, you don't want to overstate the amount of leverage the United States has even in that situation. You can't force other countries to do things that they really don't want to do, even when you're a lot stronger than they are. That doesn't mean you don't have a lot of influence, but you have to recognize you're not always going to get your way.
Well, Professor Walt and Dr. Parsi, you in 2 hours have actually done the impossible. So we're all in your debt. We have learned a lot. You have given us a lot to think about as we leave. Thank you for being here and for your insightful analysis. And thank you all for your very, very interesting and insightful questions. We hope to see you again in the future.